So, Bobby, this week marked the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And you've written a piece in Rolling Stone magazine, which I think, if people have really done some research on this, they will know some of this. But I think there is a lot of myths out there that are still repeated today as to President Kennedy's posture, both in terms of specifically Vietnam, but in terms of war in general. And the piece is brilliant. Tell us why you wrote the piece and what it is about JFK's vision of peace that we should know.
Well, I wrote the piece. The piece is kind of part of a larger book that I'm doing for HarperCollins right now. But one of the reasons I wrote this section was because people, I've watched for 50 years the reaction that people have to President Kennedy, and it's an extraordinary reaction. Even in this century, John Kennedy is the most popular president among Americans of every party. There are some presidents that are more popular with just Republicans or just Democrats, but his popularity stretches across Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and it's overwhelming. And he consistently shows up among the top 6 or top 7 presidents in history in polls among historians. He's the only one-term president on the list of top 10. And the reason for that, it's not, I don't believe, if I ask myself what made him a great president, and was it just the charm, or was it the Peace Corps, the space program, civil rights, going after the mob, all of these other things he did. And I think the reason that worldwide, when I was a kid, and even today, I'd go into huts in Africa or Latin America and see President Kennedy's picture. When I went to Europe in 1965 with my father, we were met by crowds of hundreds of thousands of people in Krakow, in Warsaw, in Normandy, in Paris, in all across Germany, in Berlin, in Italy, Greece. People who came out who loved President Kennedy, who there'd been so much anti-Americanism before he came into power, largely as a result of Allen Dulles' shenanigans during the Cold War and during the Eisenhower era. But that changed during his presidency. And, even today, my sister and I, a couple of weeks ago, met a man from Africa whose name is Kennedy. And that's very, very common. When I go to Africa, I meet people, I'm on almost every trip, who have that. And the question is, why did that happen? And, I think clearly the impact that he had on the world was not just the Alliance for Progress or, the vigor or the charm of his administration, but it was this pursuit, this extraordinary pursuit for peace that was at the core of his presidency, the repulsion of war that he had as a combat veteran himself. He told one of his best friends, Ben Bradley, that I am almost a peace at any price president. He said that he regarded his primary mission as president of the United States as keeping the country out of war. And that put him at odds with the military-industrial complex, with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and an intelligence apparatus led by Dulles, who he quickly fired, which defined his presidency. And I think that, if virtually kind of the apogee of that was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he stood against his own national security advisors, his own Joint Chiefs of Staff, virtually all of his advisors, with the exception of my father and Bob McNamara, who were urging him to do airstrikes and nuclear bombs on Cuba. And even doves, like the biggest dove in the Senate at that time was Senator Fulbright, and even Fulbright was urging him to attack Cuba, but he refused. And he found a way out of that mess that gained Khrushchev's respect. Khrushchev had already, during the Berlin crisis 1 year before, in October of 1961, had begun a secret correspondence with him. And
well, Bobby, before we go into the correspondence, I want to just back up just for a moment, because this is about the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs was basically left for President Kennedy, or I should say, it was a legacy project of Eisenhower's. Is that right?
That's right. It was actually a legacy project of Nixon's. Nixon had met with Castro and become convinced that he was either communist, in his own words, either communist or under communist influence, and therefore had to be gotten rid of. And then he nationalized the lands. Khrushchev nationalized the land. Castro nationalized the lands of the United Fruit Company. In retaliation for that, Standard Oil closed its refinery in Cuba, and Castro began buying oil from the Russians in exchange for sugar. And so at that point, the Eisenhower administration decided we have to attack Cuba. Nixon claimed to be the brainchild, in his words, quote, brainchild, end quote, of the Bay of Pigs. Eisenhower approved it a year before, for March of 1961, which landed 3 months into JFK's presidency. He was alarmed by the stench of and recoiled from the stench of the project almost immediately and didn't want to do it. He got assurances, the 1,500 Cuban troops had been trained in Nicaragua and Guatemala and were transported on United Fruit boats to the Bay of Pigs to avoid any kind of fingerprints of the U.S. on the attack. And what President Kennedy wanted assurances from Allen Dulles, who was head of the CIA, General Cabell, who was the second in command, and Bissell, who was third in command, and all three of those men were fired afterwards. And he demanded assurances that there was no chance of failure, and that there would be no need for any U.S. military involvement. He also demanded the same assurances from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and General Lemitzer, who was its chair. And Lemitzer, for his own reasons,
Bobby,
gave those assurances.
Let's take a break. When we come back, let's pick up on this, because I think this exemplifies both the relationship between President Kennedy and the national security state, broadly speaking, and the following. Despite those assurances about no U.S. involvement in Cuba, it was certainly what the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted. And this is and you can correct me if I'm wrong on the other side of the break, but this could be the first moment where that cleave between President Kennedy and the military begins. So, Bobby, when we broke, we were talking about, and this is obviously all part of the piece that you've written in Rolling Stone magazine, JFK's Vision of Peace, which I think will be quite an eye-opener for people, because in many respects, I believe that President Kennedy's, at least the conventional wisdom, is that he was far more of a hawk than I think the reality was. But when we broke, we were talking about how President Kennedy inherited this plan from Eisenhower that was fully operational at this point by the time he came in, by the time he was inaugurated, and had already been scheduled for the first couple of months of his administration. He had received assurances from both the top three leaders at the CIA and the Joint Chiefs that there would be no direct American involvement in terms of troops. When the Bay of Pigs failed, President Kennedy used that as an opportunity to rid himself of the hierarchy of the CIA.
Well, he was angry. He said it, he felt, first of all, he felt tremendous guilt about the Cubans who were 200 of them were killed and the rest of them were captured on the beach. And what the CIA had told them is that, first of all, that the public would rise up and support Castro, which was a lie. Castro was immensely popular at that point, 83% of the people in Cuba. And according to the CIA's own intelligence, strongly supported Castro and the reforms he'd made. He had an army of 200,000 people, 200,000 men, which was very well disciplined. And he had a very good very strong police state, national security apparatus that was able to control dissent. He knew this was coming. But the CIA said even if they somehow failed, that they would melt into the mountains and begin a guerrilla movement there. But the Bay of Pigs was on a swamp with no forest cover and no place to hide and no place to start a guerrilla movement. Not only that, but they hadn't even looked at the depths of the water near the Bay of Pigs. So the troops had to walk ashore, and they were gunned down as they did that. And my uncle, President Kennedy, was furious at the CIA for putting these brave men in that position. And he said as they folded on the beach, and Dulles came back to him and begged for air cover, which he had promised not to do, or to send in the Essex, which was the aircraft carrier in the battle group. Jack said to Dave Powers, Kenny O'Donnell, and Arthur Schlesinger, I want to take the CIA, shatter them into 1 million pieces, and scatter them to the wind. And afterwards, he cracked down on the CIA, defunded it by 20%, and fired its 3 top leaders.
And Bobby, let me ask you this. I mean, you in the piece, you refer to it as President Kennedy had realized that in some ways this was a trap, that the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the CIA felt that they could draw American forces in once this thing started going. I mean, I've actually been to that beach, and it is almost impossible to imagine that this would be successful, particularly, obviously, because there were tanks waiting for these 200 men. But, I mean, do you think that the drawing in of American forces was sort of baked into the plan in some way?
Well, we know that now because all of that information has been declassified, and a lot of it was declassified for the 40th anniversary of the Bay of Pigs, and there was a conference at that point that took place where the Russians declassified their documents, we declassified ours, and Castro declassified his. And all of most of the surviving planners on both sides on all sides of the crisis assembled in Havana for a conference, and at that point, the intelligence that Dulles was looking at was declassified, and it was very clear that they had deliberately lied to the president, the Joint Chiefs, for their own reason, because they knew that the CIA was going to falter. They believed that then they would be given control of the situation and that they could lead an invasion of Cuba and expel Castro. And so both Dulles and the Joint Chiefs deliberately lied to President Kennedy, and we know that today.
And this marks...
And he incidentally knew it at that point. I mean, he said to Dave Powers and Kenny O'Donnell, quote, they were sure I'd give in and send the go-ahead to order in the Essex, which was the naval group. They couldn't believe that a new president like me wouldn't panic and try to save his own face. Well, they had me figured wrong. And that's what he said at the time. So he knew that he had been sucked into a trap.
Okay, and so this begins the beginning of this is almost the defining moment of his relationship to the hawks in our national security apparatus. And as when we got to take a break, when we come back, let's talk about more of those examples and how it led up to both his desire to pull out of Vietnam and his desire to get past the Cold War. So, Bobby, when we broke, you had just told us, and as we're talking about on this week, we obviously had the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy. And we are talking about your piece in Rolling Stone magazine, JFK's Vision of Peace. You've outlined to us President Kennedy's reaction to the Bay of Pigs and the first almost, I guess, salvo when the national security apparatus of the country, the CIA, the military, realized that President Kennedy was going to be his own man when it came to saying no, essentially, to the hawks who were so, I guess, single-minded in their desire to fight communism militarily.
Well, it wasn't just that. What they believed, what the orthodoxy of the Cold War was at that point, was that Russia now had nuclear capabilities that they were still far behind us, so that they could not afford to make a first strike on the United States, because we would return a devastating second strike and destroy them. But by the end of 1965, our first strike capacity, whoever struck first, in the words of Lucius Clay, General Lucius Clay, who personally provoked the Berlin crisis, whoever struck first would also strike last, because a surprise attack could completely devastate the missile capacity of the nation. So they believed war with the Soviets was inevitable, and therefore it was desirable in the short term, and that the only way to protect our country would be to have a preemptory war against the Soviet Union. So they spent his entire presidency trying to trip that wire, trying to force President Kennedy into a position where he had to bomb the Soviet Union.
And you write in your piece that about 7.5 months into his presidency, he was essentially offered a plan for a preemptive thermonuclear strike on the Soviets and stormed out of the room.
Well, yeah, actually twice that summer, the Joint Chiefs, after the Bay of Pigs, he would convene the Joint Chiefs, but just to humor them, because he couldn't fire them. These were all icons of World War II. These were the men who had beaten the Japanese, won the war in the Pacific, won the war in Europe. They were, Curtis bombs away LeMay, who had pioneered the use of napalm against civilian populations in Tokyo and the Pacific and won the Pacific War, Lemonster, and all of these other big heroes. And incidentally, they were very right-wing people who were allied with Barry Goldwater and with Strom Thurmond on Capitol Hill, and would use military aircraft to bring those guys on hunting trips. And afterwards, Curtis LeMay actually ran for vice president with George Wallace on the American Independence Party. So these were extremely right wing. They were founders of the John Birch Society. They were people who believe that, in fact, if you see Dr. Strangelove, Stanley Kubrick's movie, he characterizes or caricatures Curtis LeMay as General Jack D. Ripper, who is this cigar-chomping, bomb-throwing maniac, but it was very, very close to the truth. And that's what he wanted, and they came repeatedly to President Kennedy whenever he convened them with plans to do preemptive strikes against the Soviet Union. And they would say to him, here are the numbers, we will lose 30 million Americans, but we will kill 160 Russians, and we will have world domination for the next century if we do this. So this is something we need to do. And they believed that he was treasonous from the moment that he failed to bring in air support during the Bay of Pigs, and then later when he refused to go into Laos, which they wanted, which Eisenhower during his transition talk urged my Uncle Jack, you have to go into Laos to support the CIA puppet that the CIA, that Allen Dulles had put in there, who is now being overwhelmed by Pathet Lao communist guerrillas. And Jack said, very, very carefully questioned them. How many troops will it take? They said 140,000 troops and probably nuclear weapons. And with that information in hand, he went and negotiated with 14 other states, including the Soviet Union, a neutrality agreement that allowed the communist participation in the government of Laos. So he was already pegged with having lost Laos, having lost, Cuba. And then he didn't bomb them in Berlin when Lucius Clay tried to plow down the Berlin Wall. And they really thought he was treasonous. They thought they called him a traitor. And Daniel Ellsberg, who was a Pentagon analyst at that time and a combat veteran from Vietnam and a war hawk, said that in the Pentagon there was, quote, a coup d'etat atmosphere, end quote.
And you outline on the multiple occasions where essentially where generals, I guess, had basically engaged in unauthorized provocations, like this crisis in Berlin. Tell us.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was very nervous that somebody would make a mistake. That he said there's always some guy who doesn't get the memo. But he was nervous that they would deliberately make the mistake. And so my father and President Kennedy said to the CIA, stay away from Cuba. This was during the missile crisis, which is, 62 is after the Bay of Pigs. But the CIA disobeyed his orders, and William Harvey, who was the head of the CIA's Miami Bureau, dropped 60 CIA commandos into Cuba during that time. The Cuban handlers at the Bay of Pigs invasion, my father later found out, the CIA handlers of the Cubans had instructed the Cubans that if orders came from the White House to discontinue, that they should arrest their CIA handlers, put them in prison cells, and go ahead with the invasion. So, and then during the Cuban Missile Crisis again, the Lemonster's aide elevated the alert system to DEFCON 5, which is one level below full-out thermonuclear war, and let the Russians know that. So they were constantly, in order to provoke greater tensions, to try to get the bombing to start. And that's what they were up to virtually the entire time that he was president.
Well, before we get to Vietnam, just tell us about who Georgy Bolshakov was.
Well, Georgy Bolshakov was a KGB agent who used to come to our house, and he was kind of a bon vivant, and he was very funny, and I had at that point, I think 8 or 9 of my brothers and sisters who were there, and we loved him because he could do the kind of Russian dancing where he would dance on his haunches, and he would do rope climbing. We had ropes in our backyard, rope swings, and he would climb up them with his legs extended, and he would have arm wrestling contests with my father, and he was your kind of typical Russian, and we knew he was a spy, and this was the time of James Bond films, and everybody was, so it was very exciting for us to have a spy in the house. The State Department was horrified and the CIA at my father's relationship with Bolshakov. But Bolshakov became a critical piece in allowing Jack to communicate directly with Khrushchev. And what both of those men realized is that they were both in the same position. Both of them were war veterans. Khrushchev had had an extraordinary war record. He had, Stalin had tried to purge him, and he had fled to Stalingrad during the height of the siege, which was not a safe place to be, by the way. But he went there, and he had a revulsion for war too. But he was surrounded by hawks in the Kremlin, and so they both needed to end run their own intelligence and military apparatus. And their first meeting Vienna.
Bobby, let's take a break here, and let's continue this conversation about the relationship between President Kennedy and Khrushchev, and also talk about setting the record straight on President Kennedy's intentions in terms of Vietnam. So, Bobby, when we broke, you had told us the story of a frequent house guest that your family had during this time, as we talk about and reflect upon President Kennedy and his vision of peace. You talked about George A. Bolshakov, who was a KGB agent, who was a frequent house guest of your family's. Knowing that he was a spy and that he was a direct conduit between President Kennedy and Khrushchev, both of whom saw themselves as having to fight their own military national security apparatus to forge some type of détente between each other. And tell us more about that relationship.
Their first meeting was very unsatisfactory because President Kennedy went to meet him in Vienna, and with the idea of proposing bilateral disarmament and to get rid of nuclear weapons and to end the Cold War and to become and begin a peace war. In other words, a peaceful competition where both nations would compete in medicine and in food and making life better for human beings. And that's what he went there to propose. And he was met by a truculent, pugnacious, bombastic Ukrainian, Khrushchev, who seemed indifferent to the threat of nuclear war. So then, a few months later, during the Berlin crisis, Khrushchev wrote a letter to President Kennedy, essentially apologizing for his behavior in Vienna. And that letter was the first of 26 secret private letters between the two, the first of which was smuggled to President Kennedy in a folded New York Times by Georgy Bolshakov. And it was handed to Pierre Salinger, and as you said, Georgy Bolshakov became the conduit between President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev, and that relationship really, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the most perilous time in the history of the human race, ended up saving the human race at that time. And during the closest that we've ever come to thermonuclear war, and in the end, the two of them had become very close together. And, the last great speech that President Kennedy made, and the greatest speech of his career, was the American University speech, where he proposed bilateral disarmament, the end of the Cold War, and the nuclear test ban, beginning with the nuclear test ban treaty. And the speech, he did not vet the speech with the State Department, the CIA, or the Pentagon. They were shocked by it. They were more shocked when they found out that he already had negotiators in Moscow negotiating directly with Khrushchev, and in 3 months he had a treaty already done. So he was able to end run them, but he had to do that because they did John McCone, who was then head of the CIA, and the Joint Chiefs went to Congress and fought like hell to make sure that the test ban treaty, which banned the underground atmospheric or explosions of nuclear weapons in space.
All right, and let's briefly just recount for us. I mean, just going backwards a little bit in time. Or I guess somewhat concurrent, is President Kennedy's plan to withdraw from Vietnam, and how this was reversed within days of his death.
I mean, it's fashionable now for people to think of the Vietnam War as a smooth continuum that began with Eisenhower, went to President Kennedy, then to Johnson, and then to Nixon. But in fact, President Kennedy fought like hell from the beginning to not go into Vietnam. And a month before his death, he signed a national security order which made it the official policy of the United States to withdraw all troops, all U.S. personnel from Vietnam by the end of 1965, with the first 1,000 by December of 63. When he was killed in November of 63, the first 1,000 were already being evacuated. Now, within 72 hours, Lyndon Johnson met with Dean Rusk, who was the Secretary of Defense at that time, and said, I am not going to be the president that loses Vietnam. And they began an escalation that would end up. The day that President Kennedy died, there were only 16,000 advisors in Vietnam. From the first day in office, he had been urged to put combat troops in. He refused again and again and again. He raised the number of advisors slightly. But even when he died, there were fewer advisors in Vietnam than he sent. He sent 20,000 troops to Mississippi to get Medgar Evers to integrate Ole Miss, to get one black student into Ole Miss. And there were 4,000 fewer troops or advisors that they sent to Vietnam, and they were technically not allowed to participate in combat, although some of them were doing that. And the day he died, the day before he died, he reviewed casualty lists that showed that to date at that point, the 73rd American had just been killed in Vietnam. And he told his aide, that's it. Vietnam is not worth a single more American life. I'm going to get out when I come back from Dallas.
Now, Bobby, we just have a minute or so left. But I mean, when we hear this story of President Kennedy fighting as much internal, if not more, internal pressure than the supposed threats to the United States. What is the lesson that we can apply today? I mean, is that infrastructure, that sort of deep state, still in existence today? Is it in the same form?
I think it's much worse today. We now have, what President Kennedy believed was that imperialism abroad was incompatible with democracy at home. And that, as Eisenhower himself said, that the growth of the national security state was the biggest threat to American values and American democracy and to our Bill of Rights. And now we can see how that national security state is eclipsing American democracy, with, all of us now being spied on, with our constitutional rights, from habeas corpus to right to jury trial to right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment, these ancient rights that came even before our Constitution, all the way back to the Magna Carta. These are the cherished rights of a free people, and they are all in the process of being eroded by this massive national security state, which is oftentimes serving the mercantile interests of U.S. corporations, and particularly the oil industry, and that also is dominating American democracy.